About a month before The Last of Us 2 came out, I heard some rumblings about a major leak that had occurred. Now, some of what I heard was worrying me, as somebody who loved the first game. The Last of Us 2 trash? Was the question posed by many a clickbaiting nonce on YouTube, or some other such internet arena. Although I managed to avoid major spoilers, I had heard about the inclusion of some LGBTQ characters, and how this had riled some people up, which got me wondering about what exactly people were so furious about. Well, let me tell you from my perspective that The Last of Us 2 is not trash. I feel as though I shouldn't really need saying, but there it is. It's an excellent gameplay, which has naturally evolved from the previous entry, astounding world building, and most importantly of all, an incredibly intricate and moving narrative to push the player forward. Indeed, I've finished my almost 30-hour run in just 2 days, feeling gripped to know what would happen next with these extremely complicated characters. That's about as much as I can say without venturing into spoiler territory, so I shan't make any attempt to dance around the story, other than saying this. The main critiques I have seen levelled at the game, largely it seems by people who haven't fucking played it, have been twofold. Firstly, that the inclusion of realistic gay and trans characters in a post-apocalyptic game is wah! Wah! I don't like the gays, which, to be frank, I'm not even going to waste my fucking time on. There are gay and trans characters. This is not all they are, and especially not to the plot, which doesn't treat them or their identity as a contrivance, but rather lets it inform the plot. They're here, get over it. Secondly, and more importantly, was an event that happens within the first 2 hours of playing, which people were furious about. Now, I obviously can't talk about it without venturing into spoiler territory. If you have played the first game and you liked it, play this one. It's good, okay? Right. From here on out, there'll be spoilers. You've been warned. Joel dies. Yep. He's horribly murdered by an as yet unidentified character with unidentified motives who happens across him out in the wilderness when he saves her life, whereupon her and her mate beat him to death with a golf club. Oh, and Ellie gets to watch. Right, so I can see why this pissed people off so much. Clearly, killing off the main protagonist of the first game, who people have no small amount of investment in, before we even see much of him in the sequel, especially in such a horrible way, is going to incite some hatred. But the thing is, that's the fucking point, you morons. The plot needs to have motivation for Ellie as a character and the player to find Joel's killers, and to put an end to them, preferably at the end of a shotgun. Introducing and then killing off a new character, like Ellie's love interest Dina, was what I had expected, and what was hinted at by the pre-release material, but in retrospect this wouldn't have worked. What investment does the player have in Dina apart from Ellie's love for her? None. This could have worked if we played through the joint grief between Ellie and Joel at their loss of Dina, but it wouldn't have worked nearly as well to motivate the player to follow through on Ellie's revenge quest. There's also a much more important reason to kill Joel off, one that's core to the plot of both this game and its predecessor. He deserves it. The actions that Joel takes at the end of The Last of Us would have history condemn him as a monster who stopped humanity from receiving a cure for the cordyceps infection, while at the same time straight up murdering scores of innocent Fireflies who are trying to save humanity. This is why Joel has to die, because of the actions of his character, ramifications of those actions. It is no mistake then that we find out his killer, Abby, was a Firefly born and bred, whose father was a surgeon doing Ellie's surgery, which the player as Joel in the escape sequence in the first game kills. Frankly, I find it hard to believe that so many people wouldn't give Neil Druckmann and the right team of writers at Naughty Dog the benefit of the doubt with this act. It is not a death that they haven't put a lot of thought into. It's not as if we don't see more of Joel later in the story, we just see them through Ellie's flashbacks and their increasingly complicated relationship through them. As expected, this killing compels the revenge quest in our protagonist in the new game, which is Ellie, to travel to Seattle and try and kill her way through Abby and her crew. She sets off in pursuit of Tommy, Joel's brother, who has departed beforehand, with Dina, her new love interest, in tow. Just to take a brief aside to talk about Dina's character, I think this is one of the weaker elements and characters in the story in terms of her depth. To be totally clear, I buy into her and Ellie's relationship as there is real chemistry between the two. I just wish we could have seen more of Dina in the story. as it is, we have lots of her and Ellie when the pair first enter Seattle, and we see her a little more in the epilogue on the farm, but much more of the runtime playing Ellie as she is relegated to an ancillary character for Ellie to protect. This is an awful shame, as I would have loved to spend more time developing and deepening the relationship between the two, as what we do get in places like the music shop on day one of Seattle are beautiful sequences. This is also at the cutscene where at the music shop, where it serves to set up the motif of the guitar and music and how important it is as a connecting theme between Joel and Ellie, as it was him who taught her to play the guitar. Throughout the first 3 days in Seattle, Ellie, Dina and a few of their friends who are along for the ride, they spend in Seattle. Ellie systematically murders her way through all of Abby's friends who are in Jackson at Joel's execution. In the process, I begin to experience some kind of cognitive dissonance with what I as a player wanted and what Ellie as a character wanted. This is a very deliberate decision on the writer's part, I believe, as while we start off on board with Ellie's mission, the lengths she is prepared to go to, making the player complicit in, will make you feel uncomfortable. One scene where she tracks down one of Abby's friends, Nora, down to the basement of a hospital made me feel genuinely nauseous, as Ellie tortures her with the assistance of fungal spores and a lead pipe. This thread culminates in Ellie's botched interrogation of Owen and Mel, Abby's perhaps two closest friends, which leaves them both dead and Ellie reeling upon discovering that Mel was heavily pregnant. When it is revealed that Dina is pregnant with her ex and Ellie's friend, Jesse's baby, I felt nothing but relief, as I thought this might motivate Ellie to give up on this fool's errand and go home. Whether or not this would have been enough for Ellie to leave her vengeance behind, we will likely never know, as Abby has managed to track down the gang to their home base, where she quickly kills Jesse and has Ellie at gunpoint when the game cuts to black. What? Closely followed by, the fuck? Was my first reaction to this abrupt cut, what I thought was the climax of the game. How did Abby find their hideout? How did she manage to take them by surprise? Did Jesse actually just die? Then, as the game slowly faded back into a gameplay section of Abby as a young girl, it dawned on me. No, they're not going to try and humanise her, are they? I asked to no one in particular. Yes, that was the answer to that question, and I'll be damned if they didn't actually kind of pull it off. What follows is another 12 or so hours of additional story, which both establishes Abby's Firefly identity and walks us through the same 3 days in Seattle from her perspective. This will go down as some of the most unexpected and amazing content in the game for me, as we flesh out Abby's friends, which the player by this point knows, as Ellie will shortly kill them. We find out more about these people, and we find out they're likeable and friendly, all having known Abby for a long time, so they were more than happy to accompany her on her journey to avenge her father, who was murdered by one Joel Miller. Abby's beef with Joel was at once personal due to her father and at the same time ideological, as she lost what had been her home as the Fireflies disbanded shortly after, in the wake of Joel's actions at the end of the first game. In many ways, Abby acts as a foil to Ellie's character, in that she is very similar to her, just further on in her character arc. She has tasted revenge, and it was not all that it was cracked up to be. It's not something that Ellie should be searching for. Later on in Abby's arc, we see her take on 2 surrogate children, Lev and Yara, after they save her from execution at the hands of one of the survivor groups, the Scars. As Lev and Yara are part of this group before going on the run, they give Abby context as to their group's belief system, being a religious fundamentalist group, and help her disentangle herself from the opposing group in Seattle, the WLF, often called the Wolves. Her learning to care for these two is a beautiful mirror to the character arc Joel has in the first game, and does a huge deal to make the player root for Abby, as well as Yara and Lev. Abby's hope of escaping Seattle with these two, and some of her friends, is promptly ruined when we discover Owen and Mel murdered at the aquarium, where we have spent so much of our time playing as Abby. The map of Seattle Ellie dropped in her horror after killing these two is the thread which leads Abby back to their hideout and leads us back to the moment we arrived at so many hours ago, but with a completely different perspective. The player is now in an awful position as they control Abby in a tooth and nail fight against Ellie, wherein Abby comes out on top, being the much stronger of the two. The fight leaves both Dina and Ellie gravely injured as Abby stands over them. As a player at this point, I was really beginning to wonder if this is how the story would end, with Ellie's revenge ultimately taking her life and the life of her friends. Unlike in Jackson, where it was Abby's judgment which spared Ellie's life, this time it is an intervention from Lev, who begs Abby not to go through with it and show mercy once again. Abby, showing her growth as a character, once again spares Ellie. This is the beginning of the epilogue, where the writers could have very easily left Ellie and Dina with their baby, Dina having given birth by this point, with a relatively optimistic ending. There is a particularly heartwarming moment where Ellie and the baby sit on an old rusted tractor and look into the waning sun. As a player, I desperately wanted the game to end here when I played through, but I knew better. Ellie has a flashback to Joel's death which manifests like PTSD and completely floors her. Through her journal entries, we can piece together that she has been dealing with this since returning from Seattle. So when Tommy, Joel's brother, comes to the farm with a lead on where Abby is now, we all know that Ellie feels the need for closure on this one, and will once again make a decision that we know to be the wrong one. While you, like me, might be screaming at the screen at this point with Ellie's decision, you can understand where they come from, and your investment in their character will allow you to push on through. I had no idea at this point where Ellie was going to end up, and I just had to know. Ellie leaves in the middle of the night and is confronted by Dina, who pleads with her to stay, but to no avail. Ellie cannot let this go, and it will now cost her relationship with Dina. The final bit of our story happens along the coast of Santa Barbara. Abby and Lev have gone looking for fireflies, which they have heard once again regrouping, and Ellie has come to finish the job and kill Abby. Once again we flip from one perspective to the other. Abby and Lev are captured by a group called the Rattlers, which use slave labour of their captives to grow crops. Ellie cuts her way through their ranks to get at Abby. By the time Ellie finds Abby, Abby is close to death, having been essentially crucified by the Rattlers following an unsuccessful prison break attempt. Ellie herself is half dead by this point and just seems to be going through the motions, and decides to free Abby and the unconscious Lev. Just as you think these two might be able to part ways without violence, Ellie is once again reminded of a flashback of Joel's death, his face smashed in. She turns to Abby and tells her she cannot let her leave. Abby refuses to fight, but on the threat of Lev's life, Abby, much like Joel, will go to any length to protect the ones they love. What follows is one of, if not the, most brutal and sickening final boss fights in the interactive medium. We are forced to be complicit in Ellie cutting down an atrophied and exhausted Abby to pieces with her knife, and finally forcing her head under the water of the shallow tide. Ellie is not unscathed either, Abby biting off 2 of her fingers on her right hand. It is only now that Ellie, for the first time in the game, has a positive memory of Joel, revealing that just before he was killed, Ellie and him were arguing, but began to mend their relationship, which had been so badly damaged by Joel's actions at the end of the first game. Just as Abby is about to die, Ellie finally relents and screams at her to leave. Abby scrambles into a boat with the unconscious Lev and leaves, leaving Ellie sitting in the shallow tide. The final minutes of the game are Ellie returning to the farmhouse which she shared with Dina and the baby, finding it abandoned, except for Ellie's music room, which houses the guitar that Joel taught her to play at the beginning of the game. Throughout the game there have been sections where Ellie plays a song on the guitar, but now she is not able to. With her 2 missing fingers she keeps missing the right notes. She puts down the guitar, looks at it, and leaves the farmhouse, finally allowing herself to let go of Joel and move forward, even though it has cost her everything. The Last of Us 2 is a fantastic game, but more than that, it's a fantastic story about revenge, human relationships, and what it can motivate people to do, and what they will lose because of it. I truly hope that people aren't not put off or have the story ruined with them by the negative press around this game, because anyone who enjoys video games should play this, without foreknowledge of its twists and turns. This game is a masterclass in narrative pacing, world building and character motivation, and I hope it is remembered as such by people who will love it as much as I do.